It's time to start, 5 o'clock. So can everybody hear me all right? On behalf of Hometown Heritage, the trustees and the staff, I want to welcome you, what a great crowd, to the 29th recipient honoree on the Wall of Witnesses, Dan Marburger. What a great recipient and honoree he is. In my welcome to you, I want to talk a little bit about what's going to take place tonight, because you have in your hand an agenda which we're going to do some flipping around. Partly because the artist isn't here yet. So he's on his way, he will be here, but we're going to take his part of the program and put it towards the end. Wall of Witnesses got its name from the Bible, Hebrews chapter 12, where it says, "So great a cloud of witnesses." And on the plaque that's on the agenda that you have in front of you, it says, "The people of Perry honor and bear witness to those among us who have made a difference. They inspire us." And certainly our honoree tonight is one of those people. This got its start when we saw in Murphy's, California, a pharmacy that had on the side of its wall reliefs, and they called it the wall of ovative comparisons. And so we said, this is fantastic, but we can do better than that in Perry. And so that began the process of us each year at Hometown Heritage of going out and selecting someone to be on the wall that is and has a tie to Perry, has an impact in Perry, and has an interesting story. Now, a little bit about Hometown Heritage. It is a 501c3 private foundation with a public purpose. We wish to tell the story at Hometown Heritage, along with Carnegie Library Museum, tell the story of small towns and the creation of people within small towns and how they affect American life. We can honestly say that through the years we've seen many, many people who impacted our community in this way. Dan Marburger being the 29th to go on the wall, we will honor him in a little bit even more. Hometown Heritage has 15,000 images, and we tell the story of people in Perry. You can go on our website, www.hometownheritage.org, and you can see many of those images just by putting in a special word or two that will draw those things up. We have almost 600 licensed oral histories. We have 57 videotaped histories. Most of these things are available on our website and are digitized to this date. They tell stories, because at Hometown Heritage, we tell stories about people who make a difference in their community. Those stories are done around 5 themes. The themes of family, faith, education, work, and loss. Our recipient tonight, the person we're honoring, certainly meets every category of those themes that we have at Hometown Heritage. And so we're so pleased to be able to honor him. We not only tell these stories, but we hope to advance them in the future by doing more interviews, doing more videos, and certainly we can look at the fact that 2024 has been an interesting year for Perry, Iowa. And yet we're a resilient community, strong. And certainly our recipient tonight is someone who demonstrated all those attributes. And we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. Our artist tonight is Rick Stewart and I'll introduce him formally when he comes through the door. We had planned to be able to go out on Sumas Court and unveil the sculpture, but I'll let him explain what took place, that he has to be carrying the sculpture in hand when he comes, and finish it tonight. And if some of you don't need to get home early, you can watch him install it as well. But I'll let him talk more about that. We want to give an opportunity, and I'm switching things around here on our agenda. We want to give an opportunity for people to say a few words. But first, I want to introduce the trustees and staff of Hometown Heritage who make this all possible. And so I know we've got some staff members here. Candy Coffin, where's Candy? Raise your hand and where she is. And Candy, okay, and Misty Von Baron oversees all of our programming through our cooperation with the Perry Public Library. And as you know, Misty is the director of the Perry Public Library. And Marilee Bales takes care of all the finances. There's Marilee back there. We have trustees here that I want to recognize as well. So one of the trustees, Clark Wicks, will speak in just a few minutes. Who else is here? Sven Peterson, our city administrator, is a trustee. Dirk Kavanaugh, our mayor, is a trustee with us. And who else? Betsy Peterson. All of you know these folks. Who am I missing? Other trustees that might be here. Oh, Mary Nichols is here. Thank you. Don't want to miss anybody. So these are the trustees that make it possible for us to do this. And we want to honor them as well as honor our recipient, Dan Marburger, tonight. I'm so grateful for his family being here with us. We began back with the process, as I mentioned, that the applications had to be in the spring. And Lindsay Pasuti, the chamber director, and the chamber helped us as we put out the word, and people sent in applications. We had an overwhelming number of applications come in this year. And I don't need to say that it would be a surprise to you that the predominance of those applications were in the name of Dan Marburger. And many of you sent those applications to us, and we're grateful for that. So it was kind of this wasn't a hard decision at all for us to select Dan as our recipient this year. So we are grateful to those. Next year, we hope to be able to do it again, and that people will reciprocate as well about that. We want to give an opportunity, and that's because our artist isn't here yet, and he will talk about the process when he comes here. But we want to give an opportunity for people to acknowledge Dan and the impact he had in their lives. And so I want to, first of all, ask Superintendent of Schools, Clark Wicks, to come and share something about Dan.
Welcome, everyone, to the Wall of Witnesses presentation. It has been a privilege to serve on Hometown Heritage Board and the Wall of Witnesses Selection Committee. When I first was on the Hometown Heritage Board, I did not realize the depth of all of the history that they have for Perry. It is unbelievable. So as Bill mentioned, go to that website. Bill came and spoke to our staff one time about Hometown Heritage, and it is really a cool thing. As Bill mentioned, when selecting the inductee for the Wall of Witnesses, had a tie to Perry, has an impact on the area, and has an interesting story. Well, I had the privilege to work with Dan Marburger for nearly 30 years as administrators. Throughout those years, Dan and I had hundreds of conversations about teaching, about learning, professional workshops. We recapped quite a few ball games and activities. An interesting note on activities and being a high school principal. I think this is just amazing. And it talks not only about Dan, but public schools and Perry schools. But Dan was part of over 1,100 activities each year. Throughout his career, just in Perry, probably attended over 25,000 different events. That's incredible. And I know Elizabeth talked about this one time as far as raising the kids and taking them up to the gym and taking them up to this activity and that activity, and just became part of their lives. But 25,000 events, it's just impressive. We were golf partners and also snow removing buddies. I'm not sure if the word buddy continued throughout our snow removing, but we would push snow, and this was not in a truck. Sometimes it was with a snowblower if it was operating, but mainly with shovels. Another interesting side note on that is Dan cleared out the snow from Sumas Court, where the wall of witnesses, many times. And many times we had conversations on that too. One of the most impactful things, though, about Dan was his genius trait. As an administrative team, we studied a book called Working Genius. Each of you and each person has two areas that are considered our true geniuses or gifts. These are traits that gives you joy, energy, and passion. Well, one of Dan's geniuses was invention. Invention. That's a person who generates ideas and solutions, has bursts of energy with new ideas come to mind. And if you knew Dan, besides being gritty, hardworking, he always he was thinking all the time about ideas. Well, one key invention and idea and solution was Dan's passion about the need to create a more equitable classification formula. A classification formula. All schools are in a class, like Class A, 1A, 2A, 3A, and so on. Well, after about a 2-year journey of many conversations and meetings, analyzing data and pondering Dan's thoughts, the Iowa Boys Athletic Association voted to have a more equitable formula. This allowed the likes of Perry and other similar schools to compete on a more equitable playing field. This genius idea allows Perry to compete in activities. Perry also changed conferences from the Raccoon to the Heart of Iowa. This idea about equity was critical for Perry and many other schools across the state. Equity and fairness is a huge deal, and it was a huge deal to Dan. Thank you to Mr. Marburger for your unending efforts to help all students and student athletes so they too can have the opportunity for success. Thank you, Dan, for your commitment to Perry Community Schools, all of your creative ideas, for your passion to serve students and staff at this great school. Dan was a great friend, and he was a true Blue Jay. Go Blue Jays, go Jayets. Thank you, Dan.
You know, it's interesting. Thank you very much, Clark, for those words. It's interesting that as a consummate educator and family man and friend and administrator, on and on, that education would have such a prominence on the wall of witnesses. I just noted in preparation for this tonight that over 30% of the folks on the wall were either full-time educators or were involved in teaching of some kind. And so I know we have a predominance of educators here with us again tonight, or ones that have been involved in the lives of students. And obviously that is something that's extremely important and impacts the community in a significant way. And it's shown by the number of people who have been honored on this wall. And certainly Dan is right at near the top. This beautiful plant that you see next to me here in the vase is something that's been given to us by Raccoon Valley Bank. And tonight, Elizabeth, we would like you to be able to take that home if you would. So I want to, at this time, she was so gracious to work with this artist beginning in June, and the whole family worked together to give us input so that the artist would have the right things to put into the relief that hopefully you'll see tonight. And so Elizabeth also was gracious enough to say that she would be willing to make a few remarks tonight. And so if you would come and do that, and then we'll give opportunities to others.
Okay, I know he's running late, but it was a great experience to work with him. He really wanted to get going on it. The kids and I, Dan had finally helped plan a family vacation. I have to start with a little humor to get myself here. So I know you probably understand that, the women kind of do a lot of the planning in a lot of homes, and ours wasn't any different than that. But Dan was adamant we were going to Florida again this summer, and he kind of was all about helping with the planning, which was something different. And so on January 14th, I was ready to, we weren't going to go to Florida without Dan. It was his thing. And the kids said, no, we're going to go. Well, then this all came up, and he really needed to get going. And so we kind of just squeezed in a trip to Newton to meet with him. And we gave him as many pictures as we could come up with. And it was really a great couple of hours. Actually, we met up in a park and sat on a park bench and told stories of Dan. He really wanted stories of Dan so that he could bring in Dan's character into his artwork. Pictures are one thing, but then the stories help him bring Dan to life. So I know he's running late, but I'm just really excited to see the artwork whenever it gets here. If it's next week, it doesn't matter. I'll get to come down and visit it the rest of my life here. So it's good. But anyway, yes. So here we are. On behalf of the Marburger family, the kids, myself, their significant others, I would like to thank Hometown Heritage and those that nominated Dan, and the Perry Wall of Witness Selection Committee for bestowing this honor of Dan on Dan. He would be humbled. He was never one for public acknowledgement of anything that he did. He really preferred to take the back seat and let others take that moment. So the selection committee, as they shared, has 3 criteria for Dan, or for this honor. And I'm going to just kind of go through those criteria and relate those to Dan. So we're going to start actually with the third one, though, the interesting story part. Most of you know Dan, the principal, Dan, the father of 5. And today I'm just going to give you some information about help you get to know Dan in the years that formed the Dan that you know. So Dan was born in Clinton, Iowa, to Ike and Carol Marburger, and he was the 4th child in a family of 6 kids. He's the 3rd boy. He has an older sister and 2 younger sisters. So Ike and Carol owned gas stations in Sebula. It's an island. If you've never been, take a trip. Anyway, that was a little side note. Sorry, I lost my place. So they owned gas stations in Sebula where the family resided. Ike delivered fuel oil. Carol ran a motel and a restaurant. Later, they would tear down the 2 gas stations and build a gas station / convenience store. Really, that wasn't a thing at that point, so they were kind of very forward-thinking in what they were doing. And they built that on the island. And then during this time, the family also built their own home. They erected a garage first, resided in the garage, built the first floor, and then built the second floor. Dan was surrounded by people, his brothers, his dad, that could tear apart and fix cars, build houses, keep tractors from the 1970s running, still even in January of this year, still that 1970s tractor, throw a new chain on a chainsaw. And Dan often joked, as he was very, very witty, that he knew his tools, he just didn't know how to use any of them. As he was the third boy, they didn't need any more hands involved. They just needed someone to retrieve and put away the tools. So that was Dan. Between Dan's junior and senior years of high school, the family moved to a farm, deciding to take on the role of hog farmers on top of the other businesses. Of course, the home was heated with a wood-burning furnace, and so the need for wood was always present. In fact, one time they were out chopping wood. Dan would have been, I think, a sophomore in high school, and Dan's dad was running a chainsaw. And I don't know. I know many of you come from a hardworking family, and it's some of the stories I'm just kind of like, geez. But Dan got clipped by the chainsaw through his leather boots, right down by his ankle. He had a terrible scar there. And Dan's dad was so mad. And he's like, well, we're finishing the tree before we can take you to the doctor. So I think the scar was probably even worse because there was some time between the actual injury and then getting medical attention. But, you know, he survived. It was fine. So Dan was the dependable, responsible son. When Dan was 12, he began closing the convenience store on Friday and Saturday nights. This would be the summer before his 7th grade year. His parents had been having trouble with the closing staff helping themselves to items on their way out the door, and so Dan was called in. This may not seem like much, but it was the only convenience store on the island, and this island has a campground, a marina. A lot of fishermen come in from Illinois, Chicago area. And it was very busy, and it was the only place, this convenience store was the only place for 20 miles that you could get gas. So they ran a good business. Of course, he wasn't driving a car at the age of 12, so at midnight, he would close the convenience store, put the money from the cash drawer in a paper sack, and then ride his 3-wheeler along the dike back to their house. And we would often laugh about how we doubted our kid's ability to be responsible with a $20 bill when he had been carrying thousands of dollars in a paper sack after closing the family business on a Saturday night. Dan participated in football, basketball, golf, and baseball while in high school. His parents were busy with the other facets of their lives, so attending high school events was really not high on their list. They made parents' night event, but rarely any of the others. When our children began participating, Dan did everything in his power to be in the gym or on the sideline. He knew what it meant to have someone there rooting for you, and he wanted that person to be him. I think this is the reason that when Claire played college ball, Seth was coaching on weekends, Dan would travel a lot of hours on many school nights to be in attendance, just to be in the gym. He needed them to know that he would make the time. We attended a lot of events, as Clark pointed out, way more than I thought, through Dan's coaching at East Central and then when he became an administrator here in Perry. Everyone knew that Dan was in the gym as a supervisor, but very few of you knew I'm sorry. Dan didn't like to miss games because it was so important to him to be able to talk with kids whose parents weren't able to attend the events. And so he would make a point of picking out those kids noticing which parents were there, and then finding them in the hallways the next day or in the lunchroom and just talking to them about the games. And I think that came back from his high school years when, when he didn't have somebody there doing that for him. And that's just the kind of guy Dan was. So the first criteria mentioned were ties to Perry. So Dan graduated from East Central Schools in Miles, Iowa in 1985. And then we went on to graduate from Central College in Pella in 1989. And upon graduation, he took the job of high school social studies teacher at East Central, and where he coached around the calendar. While we were there, he obtained his master's in administration. Dan accepted the associate principal job here in Perry in 1995, and then in 1997, he was selected as the principal. Upon his selection as the assistant principal, the Marburgers moved to Perry, and we just always felt really strongly about living in town. I know you can get both sides of that, but we enjoyed going to the grocery store and seeing the kids at the grocery store and pancake breakfasts and walking down the street and being in the park or being at the ballpark at our kids' events and just being able to make connections with the kids in different ways than we do inside the walls of a school building. And we just felt strongly about that. So first, Dan lived in a duplex out on Graceland. As he took the job in July, and the kids, which would have been Hannah and Seth at the time, we continued to live one more year in Miles. We had a house to sell and all sorts of things, and then I ended up being pregnant with Claire that year, and so spent a lot of time on the road that year, going back and forth between the two towns. Then we were moving to town at the end of the school year, and so we moved over to a house on the corner of 10th and Estella Street, right across the street from the hospital. It's a great place to raise kids. It's very convenient. We did make that trip walking a couple times, and Hannah and Seth learned how to ride a bike in the hospital parking lot on Sundays when it was empty. A year after Grace was born, we were ready to purchase a house in Perry, and so the Wyfett House, which many of you know as the Wyfett House, became the Marburger House. And Ramona Wyfett, what a treat. I don't think we'd lived there very long when Ramona called, and she was thrilled that kids were living in her house, and it was built for kids. So she would reach out occasionally through her days that she stayed here in Perry. And as far as having an impact on the community, Dan touched the lives of students and staff members spanning 4 decades. Many of you in this room today were a part of those lives touched. Dan's pride and joy was the building and grounds of Perry High School. I was so thrilled in 2002 when we'd have company from out of town, because that meant for 1 week I didn't have to go tour the development occurring at the new Perry High School, because it was a weekly outing for us. And so when people would come, I'd be like, oh, I bet they'd love to see the building. You should take them up. So, and he did every time. He was so proud of that building. The academic success of students was an emphasis of Dan's. He spent a lot of time looking for and researching programs and initiatives that would improve student learning and the school environment. He was not one to hop on the latest bandwagon. He felt strongly about finding quality and sticking with it. Dan took great joy in the successes of the students in and out of the school day. He continued to try and keep track of kids beyond graduation. And of course, Dan's actions on January 4 will forever impact Perry. Family trees will continue to grow and blossom because of Dan's actions on January 4th. The kids and I know the Dan the world saw on January 4th well. He's our protector, he's our comfort to be close to, and a very empathetic man. And he demonstrated this in his last moments as the principal of Perry High School. He protected as many kids and staff as he could. He tried to comfort and reassure a troubled young man by trying not just once to get him to lower his shotgun and stop shooting, because it's never too late to make a better choice. Dan was a hero that day. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I know that on January 4th, when the news broke, and then again, well, the entire time we were in Des Moines, and then again on January 14th, I know that your hearts were going out to myself and my family. And I know that they've continued to do that for the last 262 days that we've been here without Dan. We miss him every day. And I'm so thankful for things like Hometown Heritage that will give us a place to come and treasure him for as long as we're here. We have no plans of going anywhere, but, you know, for as long as I'm allowed to be on this earth. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being willing to share with us tonight. That was very, very special. When I came in tonight, Misty asked me if I had plenty of Kleenex for the crowd. And now I know why she said that. So thank you. This is I know that would be impossible to follow almost. But this is an opportunity that we've given every year for people who feel so inclined to honor Dan with a few words. We would ask you, family members, if you wish first, and then some of you who have had the opportunity to know Dan. All of us who knew Dan went away with great respect. I worked with him on all the exhibits that we did, Hometown Heritage did in the high school, and he was a joy to work with, and continued to challenge us in getting something there that would be significant in the education realm. So with that, I'll give opportunity for someone to come forward. We're still waiting for the artist, so please do that. Who's next? You know, the pump has been primed, so every year we have people come. So please, I know it's a big crowd, but please come.
I know it's really hard, but if you do have stories of Dan, the kids and I love hearing stories of Dan. It's just some of you had experiences with Dan that we didn't know about, and so we love hearing about those as well. And not that you have to do it tonight, but you know, if you reach out, drop it in the mail, or stop us on the street corner, we usually share those with each other, and it helps us keep them with us.
I can't resist that, Garrett.
Thank you, Clay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Misty Von Baron, and unfortunately, I did not know Dan Marburger very well. He came in 95. I graduated in 93. I had no children. However, we were part of homecoming, so I got to know him through that. And I just have one thing that I had a conversation with him about, and it happened to be the homecoming dance. And it was a few years ago, and he just said, he goes to the kids that were in the student council, he goes, "All I know is there's not going to be any of that grinding like there was at prom." And so that is my Dan Marburger story, and I think of it often. And so I wish I would have gotten to know him, because I know that he would have been a very funny and humorous man. So I'm glad that he's going to be up on the wall for many years to come so that people can enjoy that.
I think under any circumstance, it's super awkward to get up in front of a room full of strangers. So I'll lean into that a little bit by divulging that I grew up in Jefferson. My name's Clay Thompson. I've known Dan and Liz for 36-ish years when we were students together at Central College. And Dan was a housemate. And it's a little bit hard to describe, but, you know, there were like 15 of us who were juniors and sophomores, and then there was Dan, who was a senior. And he was only a year or two older than us, but he inspired us, and he had a super hot girlfriend slash fiance. And he just held himself as an adult, you know, at 21, 22. And hearing, you know, sort of his origin story, that makes a lot of sense. And we learned so much just by watching him and how he conducted himself and how he handled situations. And, you know, I won't tell any specific stories about Dan, but I do have vivid memories of Liz walking into the house. And I'll leave the profanity out, but it had to do with the effect of clean this place. And she was the only one that we would do that for, because she got our attention. The thing mostly that I learned from Dan, though, that has been so valuable throughout my life, and particularly, you know, my career, is there's a value in doing hard things, even if you don't really understand it at the time. And Dan, I'm always careful with my language about my relationship with Central College football. I don't say I played football at Central College. I say I was on the team for 4 years, because despite having some modicum of success as a Jefferson Ram, I never got to really see the field as a Central College Flying Dutchman. And I remember being out there in practices, you know, on 90-degree days with 100% humidity. And I remember being out there in late November getting ready for playoff games when it was below freezing. And I remember kind of asking myself, why in the world am I doing this? I'm a third or fourth string defensive end who's small and slow. And, you know, I would look across the huddle to the offensive side of the ball, and there was Dan absolutely working his butt off to make us all better. And it was hard for him. It was hard for me. And you know, neither he nor I saw a lot of what, you know, would be conventionally described as success on the game field on Saturdays. But the experience of going through that and the relationships we formed started a pattern, I know for Dan, because we saw it play out, of doing hard things and benefiting not himself always, but certainly the community around him through the accomplishment of those hard things. And just really seems appropriate that, you know, in the last 10 or 11 days of his life, that was a hard thing that he did for the benefit of a lot of other people. And I keep hearing this phrase when I read other accounts and other people talking about how they found out, when they found out. And the one phrase everyone uses is, we weren't surprised. And that was Dan. So I hope I've successfully killed time for the artist to arrive.
That's great. Somebody else.
I hadn't really planned to talk, but they were peer pressuring me over in my section. I remember the first time meeting Elizabeth Marburger. We were at a function, and I said I went to Central as well. Now, Skip wanted me to play football, but I just was a study guy. So they had to find a different middle linebacker. So, well, anyway, Elizabeth said, you went to Central? And I go, yeah. And she goes, did they have Schulte dormitory when you were there? Now, this dormitory is like 90 years old. And I was so offended. I mean, I was in my early 60s when you asked. My favorite, I have many Dan Marburger stories, but my favorite is we were hard up teachers and you had to do something in the summer so that you could buy, shoes and clothes for the school year. And so I had a detasseling crew and I convinced Dan to be a member, and we were out in a cornfield and it was so hot. And it was break time. I was the foreman. It was fun to boss Dan around. And I remember you had to cross a barbed wire fence, climb up a ditch to get to the road where we had our lunch. And Dan was the last one out. He wore these weird nylon pants. I mean, it wasn't farmer-like at all. And as he's crossing the fence, he got stuck. And we were, the three of us, Pete Kavanaugh, Todd Subert, and Mark Pennington, we were up at the top having our lunch, and Dan goes, I could use a little help. And we start singing Desperado. Desperado, you gotta come down from your fences. Well, he finally got off the fence and came up the ditch and had lunch with us, and it was a very happy time that we had. And I don't think he wore the nylon pants ever again. And we were all excited about that. I could talk for hours about Dan. He was so much younger than I was, but he was like a father figure. I know that's weird, and that speaks to my immaturity. But as Elizabeth said, oh, we miss him. We miss him so much. But he did inspire so many people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adair. This is perfect. Dr. McCauley.
Well, I had the privilege of working with Dan for 8 years when I was superintendent here at Perry. And Dan was an excellent principal. He was the best high school principal that I'd ever worked with. And two stories about Dan that I remember. One was that Clark Wicks and Dan Marburger would just be relentless at our administrative team meetings about in the fall when Central would play Luther in football. And they'd always be going back and forth who was going to win the game. And they just had a tremendous relationship, I thought, as principals. It was always enjoyable to hear them talk. But every summer there's an administrators golf tournament. And so we put together a team, and I know Dan was on it, and Clark and myself. I can't remember who was the fourth one. It might have been Gary Chernikowski. I'm not sure. But anyway, we're playing at the Blank Golf Course in Des Moines, and it's right next to the Blank Park Zoo. And so on this one hole, you could see the zoo off to the left there, quite a ways over. I mean, it was a long ways over there. And the hole is this way. And so we hit our drives, and now Dan steps up to hit his drive. And I don't know what happened, but it just went way, way left. And it went over by the giraffe area. And for the next several holes, that's all we could hear for about was Dan hit his ball over with the drafts. Dan hit his, and it was fun. And one other time I remember, this was more serious. We needed to cut the school budget, and so we had a big meeting where I was talking to everybody, all the departments, as far as transportation, maintenance, every building had to cut the budget somehow. And I was leaving it up to all the principals and the directors on what they were going to cut. And this is one of the few times I saw Clark and Dan kind of suggesting to the other one what they could cut out of their own building budget. And but we did finally get through all of that and made the cuts that we needed to make. But it was always a joy to work with Dan. He was a very professional person, very good principal, and I always enjoyed visiting with him. And I can remember going to his office and talking about whatever problem we were dealing with, and he was always good at helping us to resolve any issue or problem that we had. So that's what I remember about Dan.
I love Dan's passion, and I had a daughter who went to Central, played volleyball there, and she was all conference in 4 sports. And I remember being at games with Dan when he had daughters playing. Boy, could I identify with that. We were in Ogden, and Ogden had a guard. Anybody know that gym at Ogden is like this, tiny, and the concrete comes right down to the floor. And there was a guard on the Ogden team who kept shoving our guard, one of Dan's daughters, which one was it? Kept shoving her into those bleachers, those concrete down. And so they finally called an intentional foul. Well, Dan and I are sitting there and we know better. That's a flagrant foul. We know the difference. And we're going to let those officials know that. And we were told one more word and we're out of there. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, the bus driver and the principal. Picking up the game, the bus. I love that passion.
I never thought I'd get up here in front of people, but I have 2 stories. When my husband was dying of cancer, Dan talked him into not retiring, but staying there. So he would keep getting his insurance. And also, it enabled me to get an insurance policy of my own when he died, because he still had a few days of sick leave left. Not too many, but a few. And so I really appreciate that. The second story is with my son, who teaches biology like my husband did. And he had a job as a biochemist, and the company that he worked for had decided to move, and he wanted to stay around here. So he got his subbing degree. And it just so happened that Mr. Tell me, who went to the service, Mr. Mice, was called away to go to Afghanistan. And so Jeff was called in to sub for him for the year. And while he was subbing, Dan talked Jeff into getting his teaching certificate. He just had science. And so he was able to, by going online, mostly, he had to go away for a few courses, but he was able to get his teaching certificate, and along with that, his master's degree. So I really appreciate that also.
I'm Nate Luderman. For anybody in here who doesn't know me, I'm terrified of public speaking. So I had no idea that that people were going to talk, and I just felt like I had to. So I graduated last year from Perry, and for me, I'm involved helping in a lot of activities. And so I got to know Elizabeth really well freshman year at the table for basketball. But one of the best things for me was last year we played Ogden in football, and if anyone was there, we threw a pick six and lost the game. And on the sideline, I was a manager, and I kind of lost it. I was not a good example of what Perry should look like, especially being on the sideline. And so I was freaking out. I was like, this is it for me. And my mom told me, go talk to Mr. Marburger. And like, this is just what I remember him for. Is he told me, I walked in and I said, I'm sorry, like, this is not how someone should behave. And he just said, thank you for the apology. I know that you won't do that again, and I forgive you, and keep doing what you're doing. And so that's so meaningful to me. And also the day that he passed away, I went to talk to the Marburgers, and I don't remember if it was Ainsley or Grace. I forget. I'm so sorry. But one of you told me that he had said that it was the year of Nate because he worked to get me to help get me paid for doing all this stuff in the scoreboard. So I'm so thankful for him for doing that, because it just means so much to me. And I was babysat by the three youngest. And the first thing I ever remember from Mr. Marburger was when Grace hit our light pole, and she started crying with us in the car and said, oh my God, I have to call my dad. And so that was the first day I saw him. He was not very happy, but after that, I just have a really close relationship with him and the entire family. And I mean, Elizabeth has done so much for me, even after all this. Like, she's been like a second mom to me, helping me when things are hard and just like showing up to my house when I needed it. And so I'm so thankful to all the Marburgers and everything they've done. And so happy that that they continue to honor Mr. Marburger.
I'm Brenda Minton, and I was a high school English teacher for a number of years, and now I'm an instructional coach at the high school. And Dan hired me. He took a chance on a first-year teacher who was very shy at the time and timid, and so I appreciate that about him. And he was pretty intimidating for a young girl out of college, but he was so kind, and once I got to know him, I just appreciate so many things about him. But many of you probably don't know, a couple years ago, I made the mistake of telling my husband that there was a job opening in Humboldt, and 100% of his family lives in Humboldt, and he trains racehorses there. So he was driving back and forth every day. So he thought moving there would be a great idea. And I remember going in to ask Dan for a recommendation letter, and I was so afraid of letting him down. And I remember starting crying. And he's like, it's okay. He probably thought I was crazy. He's like, you're asking me for the letter, like, right? But he wrote just a glowing letter. And I remember him saying it would be such a loss to the district and how proud of me he was. And I went and interviewed, and it went really well. But I remember thinking all through the interview, I'm like, their facility, Dan would never stand for these facilities. He'd have that fixed and that fixed. And then I remember comparing the principal to Dan, and the other principal did not measure up at all. I'm like, you need a mentor. Dan can help you out with that. And so I kind of realized that he ruined me. I can't work in another district. I love this district. And he was such a great administrator that no one else is ever going to measure up. Sorry, Brad, but no one else is ever going to measure up. And so I was very, very thankful to turn it down. And I remember when I was asking him for that letter, he said, it's okay. Family is the absolute most important thing and should guide all of your decisions. And while that made me feel better, it helped me to realize, too, that our Perry is our family. And I was so thankful for him taking a chance and all that he taught me and all that I learned from him. And one of the best things I learned from him, Misty talked about homecoming, and I do a lot with homecoming, and we're proud to continue our volunteer day that Linda Kaufman and Dan got going. And I'm kind of a control freak, so I don't like when things go awry. And so I remember the first year doing that, there was a student or two that made a poor choice. And at the end of the day, I was so frustrated. I'm like, and he said, Brenda, stop. He's like, think about the hundreds of students that were out volunteering and all the good that we did today and the effect that we had on our community and the lives of those kids and what they've learned. And so we're not going to let one or two issues ruin the good. And he had an uncanny ability to be able to believe the best in people and look to the good. And so I will take that with me.
Wow. The artist is here. We'd like more. We'd like this. It's never been better. Please, someone else.
I have just one quick one. I know I was already up here, but like I said, Dan and I worked quite a few years together. Well, I also officiated with Don Strachey, who's in the audience. And through these activities, we played Carol many times. And we also dealt with their fans many times. So if you're from Carol, this story stays here. All right? We can stop the recordings. Dan and I did not care for our Carol rivalries. And there's many stories with that, such as a person coming up to a football game and parking by the Dewey Field, and Dan and I would say, hey, you can't park there. And they said, hey, we're parking here because we paid here, and that's how it goes. So Dan and I had to have these conversations. What are we going to do with these Carol guys? So now I'm officiating. And it's a JV game. And in JV game, one person and the fans can almost control the whole atmosphere if they're loud enough. Well, of course, Don was making some very poor calls that night. Just kidding, Don. It was me. So this guy, he was about as big as Dan. And he was yelling at me in that first half every time I went by. And he was about 3 or 4 rows up, and he was yelling loud enough that everybody could hear him. So now we get to halftime. And I said, hey, Dan, this Carol guy is yelling on every call that I make. And I said, I've had just about enough. And he said, Clark, he's from Carol, right? I said, yes, he is. Give him a short leash. So the second half begun. First time down the court, made a call. And that guy is standing up yelling. And I looked over at Dan. I looked over at this guy that was now yelling at me. And I said, just like this, Mr. Marburger walked over to that guy and he said, let's go. After the guy left, I said, thanks for the support, Dan. But that's the way that Dan was. If I needed him at any time, whether it was on the court or in the classroom or whatever the case was, he was always there. Great supporter, and he took care of our Carol fans.
All right. Sven Peterson, former student of Dan and friend of the family. I have a few stories, and I'm going to do my best to not rat anybody out that's here tonight. And I don't know, Elizabeth, if you're still like have the power to like ground your kids. I don't know that ever expires. So one night, as Dan did, was a wonderful coach to kids, in even his own kids. And it was probably a Friday night, and the bus was coming back late. It also happened to be snowing that evening, which made the high school parking lot the perfect place to, let's call it, practice winter driving skills. And me and probably a couple of my cronies were spinning donuts in the high school parking lot. And all of a sudden we see this bus with the headlights, and probably all simultaneously we say some bad words, and we just hightail it out of there. I think we went right by the bus, and Dan looked over at a student that was sitting right next to him and said, "Do you know who that was?" And looked at him and said, "No, I don't." So I've thanked Hannah for that many times over the years, because it probably got me out of a call to the principal's office, which I appreciate. Which it's hard to believe that I never actually got called to the principal's office in high school. We sent Mr. Adair there. But Dan's leadership style and just the way he is, we, again, a group of us, may have been doing some evening exploring of the tunnels underneath the middle school, which hopefully there's no students here to learn that there's tunnels, by which we gained access to by borrowing a key off of Darren Steva during shop class, going to Ace during school, making a copy of the key, and then putting the original back on his keychain without him ever realizing it. So naturally, we got caught in the tunnels. And again, we were not called to the principal's office. We were called to the cafeteria during lunch, in front of all of one of the lunch periods. Comes on Sven Peterson, Joey Kinsterbergen, Michael Collins, Nick Zander, please report to the office. So we start walking the walk of shame, and there's Mr. Marburger and Officer Pat Jans just standing right there in the middle of the lunchroom. And as the 4 or 5 of us walk in, the entire lunchroom just goes, "Oh." And again, it wasn't a lecture or anything like that. It was just, you guys know better. Don't do it again. You're seniors, you're almost graduated, just don't cause any more problems. And we didn't that he knows about, so that's fine. And so just also, again, in college, I think Hannah, so much like Dan, in that she was just our mother hen in college. And I think we were having a study night at our house. And of course, Hannah's the responsible one of the group. And we needed to go get more study materials. So she was able to drive us to Hy-Vee for study materials. And it wasn't until we were walking back out, we realized we are on a beer run in the principal's car with educator plates on it. And we're like, Dan would be so proud of you, Hannah. Thank you for the ride. But those are a snippet of some of the stories that can be told in such a public venue. But, so many good memories and such a good person to learn from and be mentored by. And despite those stories, when I came into my role as an adult and sent emails, I always sat there and thought, I can't believe he has to just cringe every time he sees Sven Peterson, city administrator. Really? But coming from being a student to working with Dan in professional capacity, it was always awesome, and such a great person. And all of the attributes that everybody's talked about tonight live in every single student that went through Perry High School with Dan. And there's pieces of that are all across Iowa and all across the United States that are still showing those attributes and making him proud. So thank you for sharing him with us.
Are you hearing some new stories tonight? Yeah. You don't have to be done. If you've got something you'd like to say.
Oh, sorry. A lot of you are sharing stories that are bringing things up for me. But first of all, I want to just say that a lot of you in this room, Dad may have made an impact on you, but you definitely made an impact on my dad and on all of us kids. And we're forever grateful for living in this town and getting to share our lives with all of you. We really miss Dad. Growing up and going to Central College games, Dad made sure to show us the team picture he was included in. By the way, Mr. Adair, you're more of a kicker type body, not a middle linebacker. But Clay was talking about Dad, and growing up, I always thought, oh, Dad played on the Central team, and I was like a sophomore in college when it finally came out that no, Dad did not play on the Central team. He was explaining to us that all of his teammates would be jamming out in the locker room, and you could find my dad napping in the wrestling room before his games. And I don't know, that just, to me, that's just a dad like thing, just napping. But Dad was very mellow. He was quick to react at sometimes, and sometimes he was the best one to talk to about things first, and just very mellow and straight to the point. A lot of teachers, I'm sure you went into his office, and Mrs. Benton, intimidating, very intimidating, but he knew how to handle a situation, handle us kids, and God picked a good person to raise 5 of us. So I just wanted to thank you guys, everyone that showed up here tonight, and just for making an impact on us kids, and definitely on my dad, because he is who he was because of you guys and what you taught him, and the sarcastic emails he got back from Mr. Adair, and everything. He was so happy to share his life with all of you. So thank you.
First of all, I got to get even with Mr. Wicks. Why was he blaming me when the referee was on him all night long? But anyway, I just got one short story to tell that Mr. Marburger, that the last game of before Christmas, we was leaving for California and was up clear about almost to the top, and Dan comes up, talks to me, says, "How's everything going, Don?" I says, "Great." And he says, "Well, I just thought I'd say hi to you." And he knew I was leaving for 2 months. And I thought that was really respectful for somebody to come up 3/4 up the stairs and say hi to you and ask me how everything's going. So I just really respect him for that.
Anybody else?
So there's been a lot of sports talk, and anyone that knows me knows that I'm the least athletic of the family. They ran out of the athletic gene by number 5. So I kind of threw my dad a curveball. Hopefully I used that reference correctly. By being the theater kid. So my dad had to learn how to talk theater and all sorts of different things with me. So my dad got to experience sitting in a theater watching me perform, or sitting at speech events waiting hours for my turn to finally come up. So a few things kind of came to mind as everyone's telling their stories of athletic events with my dad. My dad and I got to spend a lot of time in the car together, riding to events, but also because I didn't get my license until I was 18, I got to ride to school with Dad every morning. And during speech season, if you knew my dad, you knew that he loved old country music that told a story, or just sad music in general. And one morning my dad was listening to his music and the song Golden Ring came on. And my dad goes, "Now this is what you need to perform. You need to talk to Mrs. Bollifer, because this is the song you need to perform." I was like, "Dad, I don't think I can do that." Okay, well, I tried. And then there were many times after basketball games that I would come home crying to my sisters because my dad would be in the bleachers telling me, "You need to get lower than your girl." And I'd start crying on court going, "I don't know what that means." Getting lots of personalized lessons from my sisters. So one of my last memories with my dad, my siblings can attest to this. I probably have spent a solid amount of my life singing in the shower. So one of them was a song called She Used to Be Mine from Waitress. And I was so proud of myself because my dad and I were going Christmas shopping for my mom. And my dad's listening to his music. We're talking about all these lyrics. And if my dad ever showed you the album Stick Season by Noah Kahan, I take credit for that. I sent it to him. He told me I didn't, but that's a lie. So we're driving back home and the song She Used to Be Mine came on, and I was very impressed. I said, "Dad, I didn't know that you got into musicals." And my dad kind of chuckled to himself and he goes, "Well, when you were in Florida, I'd put it on when I missed you." So I'm just so sad I didn't get to have more of those conversations with my dad, as I was just starting to get his love of theater finally after 21 years of my life. But so yeah, sorry.
I don't want to cut, those chairs are comfortable. I don't want to cut it off if somebody wants to say another word.
Just a real quick funny dance story. Ainsworth's lovely stage group. One day I got a phone call in the middle of the day from Dan, and he never called in the middle of the day, and I answered the phone, and I was like, "Dan," and he said, "Do you know what lights are on the stage?" And I'm like, "What?" "Do you know what lights are?" And I'm like, "Where are you?" And he said, "I fell off the stage." Lights, and he fell off the stage. And he called me laying on the floor of the auditorium. I'm like, I don't know, along a wall somewhere. I didn't know how much time. I'm like,
What a legacy. Wow. This has been terrific. Thank you so much for the input, and it's just been phenomenal. I mentioned to you earlier that, and I'm so grateful that Elizabeth also mentioned this, the artist that we've used on most of these reliefs, Rick Stewart from Newton, Iowa, is a consummate sculptor. But beyond that, he's a great person. And so he has not only done a wonderful job of doing bas reliefs to go on the wall for the legacies that these people have created, but he's gotten involved with the families and become their friends and gotten emotionally involved with them. And while he's a great sculptor, he's lousy on a schedule. But he's a great friend of ours. He's a great friend of Hometown Heritage. And I'll let him tell a little bit about the process. But you need to know, this is the fella who has, if you went to the Hall of Pride, he has 7 sculptures in the Hall of Pride. Sean Johnson, Clyde Duncan, Chris Street, Bernie Sagaw, on and on, with sculptures that he's done. He's one of the finest sculptors certainly in the Midwest. And he's a teacher, he's a friend. I've had I remember Jim Wallstrom saying, by the way, Jim is the only living recipient of this, and Jim saying, this is a friend for life, because of how Rick Stewart got involved in knowing the family and the people before he made the sculpture. And so I've asked him to come and just tell a little bit about the process. And then if you want to see him complete the thing tonight, that'll be possible as well. So Rick Stewart, come.
I always think it's going to take so much less time than it really does. I'll just take a minute, just a little minute. So today, the sculpture was supposed to be finished in here, and I'd been up for 38 hours trying to make it happen. And the last thing I did was I put it in the oven, the rubber sculpture into a rubber mold, and then that got placed into the oven. So it could be done in 2 hours' time, and I could take it out, and I could go ahead and mix my bronze powder and resin and fill it, and it would be all done, and I could run up here and install it, and it'd be just on time. And I took a shower, and then I sat down in my easy chair. And then I sort of nodded off. And then my wife woke me up at 4 and said, "Aren't you supposed to be somewhere at 5? Oh no, it's 4 o'clock. Oh no. So anyway, that's why I'm late. But the neat thing is you actually get to see what that process is, because we will take it out of the mold, the original sculpture out of the mold, and then we'll mix up the stuff. If you want to hang around and watch, probably do that outside. This is a really nice carpet. But we'll mix up bronze powder and resin, and we'll pour it in and hang around for an additional 20 minutes. It'll be ready to pop out, and you'll see what it looks like as one unified color. Because when you sculpt something, I guess particularly in bas relief, because you're working from a flat image. And so, it's a normal thing to start out with is a piece of plywood, to model out as a modeling board. But in the process of doing that, I'm also a carpenter. I'm a 5th generation carpenter. And so while my kids were in school, Dad wasn't going to be able to make much of a living as a sculptor back then. So it was turn his hand to other things like being a carpenter and building houses and that sort of thing. So using those skill sets are really beneficial for a sculptor. So, and a sculptor does not care what kind of material you use. It doesn't matter to the sculpture at all. You can use wood and clay and glass and steel and cement, whatever you have at hand it's going to work and do what you want it to do. And then when you're all finished with it, then you can make a mold of it and you cast it in another material. It's all a single color again, or you can choose to pigment it differently. So today what you'll see when I take it out of the mold, you'll see this, you'll see some plywood, you'll see some bits of wood, you'll see some white, like plastic urethane, and then you'll see modeling clay. And so it's kind, and you'll see little where it's been nailed together pieces, and you'll see those have been filled nail holes like you fill in anything when you're doing the cabinet work or anything. You fill it. Well, they're filled, but they don't have to be as pretty because, from my standpoint, once the original sculpture is done, I make the mold of it. Then I just tear it apart. I reclaim the clay, and it goes back into the bucket, and it's ready for the next sculpture. So the clay doesn't ever get bad. This clay I've got is probably 40 years old. Still using it. It still works great. So for you who don't know much about it, clay is just regular dirt. I mean, it's just, clay is a fine particle material underneath your black dirt. You get rid of that, and you get down into the clay portion of the gummy kind of sticky stuff. Gets on your shovel, and anybody's dug a hole and knows what that's like. You get down so far, and you got gumbo on it. Well, that's clay. Now, water-based clay. And Native Americans around here, did lots of pottery with it. And here in the Midwest, all through Iowa, there used to be ceramic studios that made tiles, tiles for toiletry, for running sewage through, making sinks and all kinds of things. Our clay is really nice. It's got a high sulfur content, so when you fire it, it smells like rotten eggs. But after it's fired, you're okay. But when you're doing lots of that sort of thing, they frown on it. The EPA kind of doesn't like that so much. So our clay industry kind of went away to places where clay is much cleaner and not so nasty. So, all right. So what we did is we talked with the family first to get an idea, so I could meet Dan surreptitiously. They were so kind. They provided me with all these wonderful photographs that I really loved. They've been so much help. And I told them that when I spend so much time looking at a face, trying to capture that, the more material I have, because I carry on conversations when I'm sculpting. You get bored when you're by yourself, and so who better to talk to than the subject you got there? So I carry on conversations with Dan. So he was. I found him to be a wonderful grandfather, a great dad. So all the pictures were really wonderful. All those tell so many stories about each and every one of you guys, and what a special place in his heart you all have. And I hope you know that. There's no doubt about it. You look so happy with all of you. So you guys were truly blessed to have him be in your life, be part of your life, be your life. And I'm blessed to be able to get to know him, even though I never met the man a day in my life. But I feel like I do know him. So anyway, let's go ahead. If you have any questions or anything about stuff, I'll be happy to explain it. But I was going to grab some of those supplies and bring them in. So that'd be great. All right. We'll demold it.
I want to be sensitive to folks who need to leave too. If you can stay and watch some of the process here, you'll enjoy it. And obviously we want the family to be able to see some of the finished product as well. I want to conclude at least the talking portion of this, and I'm sure Rick is going to share with you as we go along some of the process. But I want to say that if you're like me, when you get home at night and you open your mail, there's a preponderance of letters and requests from not-for-profits about needing help. And so basically what many of those not-for-profits are doing is reaching out to people who have an appreciation for the work that they do. And so I would be remiss on behalf of our trustees and staff if I did not do the same thing. And if there's an appreciation on your part for the work that Hometown Heritage does, we're all volunteers, very few paid people. And if you have an appreciation, you can go to our website, as we said, hometownheritage.org, and show your appreciation. You can do that direct with me or one of the trustees as well. And in that way, say, we like what you're doing. We want you to continue to do it, and we will do that. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time to be with us. I want to thank the Hotel Pattee, who always does an incredible job on our behalf, our staff, the trustees. Thanks again.